This program provides a brief overview of CCRC tax exemption as governed by the Internal Revenue Service. The language of the law is straightforward, but its application is anything but, and people who are interested in great detail should continue on to the more extensive and exhaustive and detailed review of this topic in another program in this section. But looking at the text of Internal Revenue Code 501c3 simply tells us that corporations and any community chest, fund, or foundation organized and operated exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific, testing for public safety, literary or educational purposes, or to foster national or international amateur sports competition, but only if no part of its activities involve the provision of athletic facilities or equipment, or for the prevention of cruelty to children or animals, is to be considered charitable and therefore tax exempt, subject to a number of conditions. As mentioned, the much longer program on the Internal Revenue Service concept of charity is more authoritative in detail. Suffice it to say that the whole topic of tax exemption is complex and not for amateurs. Expert guidance is needed in wending one's way through the Internal Revenue Service's rulings on exemption, and it helps if the expert advisor has contacts within the Internal Revenue Service, particularly in the Office of the Counsel, to provide guidance for just how the service currently is thinking. Grounds for tax exemption have included, among other things, the following: relief of the poor and distressed or of the underprivileged, advancement of education or science, erection of public buildings, monuments, or works, lessening of the burdens of government, promotion of social welfare, promotion of public health, environmental action, public interest law firms, and amateur athletic organizations. An observation is that the grounds for exemption toward the bottom of this list tend to be more recent and involve greater ambiguity and less certainty of exemption. Until 1972, the rule for homes for the aged, including continuing care retirement communities, was quite stringent. Revenue Ruling 57467, issued in 1957, held that a home for aged people that does not accept charity guests and that requires the discharge of guests who fail to make certain required monthly payments is not organized and operated exclusively for charitable purposes and is therefore not entitled to exemption from federal income tax under Section 501c3 of the Code. Revenue Ruling 72124 in 1972 explicitly revoked this prior stringent holding. Since 1972, CCRC exemption has been governed by Revenue Ruling 72124. As mentioned, it explicitly revoked the prior requirement that charitable subsidization be involved. It found that, quote, providing for the special needs of the aged has long been recognized as a charitable purpose for federal tax purposes where the requisite elements of relief of distress and community benefit have been found to be present, end quote. This ruling allowed the CCRC industry to flourish. It should be noted, though, that since a revenue ruling is simply an administrative finding, it is a fragile basis for the tax exemption of luxury CCRCs. Looking at some of the specifics of this important revenue ruling, number 72-124, we see that financial subsidization of aged residents is no longer required. Thus, an organization otherwise qualified for charitable status under Section 501c3, which devotes its resources to the operation of a home for the aged, will qualify for charitable status for purposes of federal tax law if it operates in a manner designed to satisfy the three primary needs of aged persons. These three primary needs are the need for housing, which is to be tailored specifically to housing appropriate for the elderly, the need for health care, and the need for financial security. This last requirement, the need for financial security, has been interpreted to mean that residents are to be maintained in residence even if their assets run out and they no longer have the wherewithal to pay the fees required by the provider. But there's been some ambiguity in this, since providers are able to avoid this requirement if they are able to show that the resident has spent funds in an inappropriate way. Some have argued that even retaining a caregiver rather than using the provider staff is sufficient to disqualify the resident from later receiving assistance. Others have argued that luxury living, such as taking cruises, is sufficient to disqualify people from the provision of financial security. This is an area that varies widely from one CCRC to another, and there have been few actual tests of it in practice. Continuing with the specifics in Revenue Ruling 72-124, the ruling explains why the Internal Revenue Service shifted its position. The ruling states, "It is now generally recognized that the aged, apart from considerations of financial distress alone, are also, as a class, highly susceptible to other forms of distress in the sense that they have special needs because of their advanced years. For example, it is recognized in the Congressional Declaration of Objectives, contained in the Older Americans Act of 1965, that such needs include suitable housing, physical and mental health care, civic, cultural, and recreational activities, and an overall environment conducive to dignity and independence, all specially designed to meet the needs of the aged. Satisfaction of these special needs contributes to the prevention of distress." So this became then the rationale for a changed position, that no longer did an elderly person have to be indigent to qualify for charitable treatment of the needs of old age. From this we can conclude that the tax exemption for financially self-supporting CCRCs is somewhat tenuous since it results only from an administrative ruling reflecting a change in position within the Internal Revenue Service rather than from a statute enacted by Congress. The conditions for tax-exempt qualification are varied and specific, including housing, activities, and related support for the elderly. Finally, tax exemption for CCRCs is part of a much larger and highly complex concept of charity. And as these concepts of charity shift, their impact on the CCRC exemptions could come under scrutiny. If you want the more detailed and authoritative, turn to the program on the IRS concept of charity, which is based on materials prepared directly by the Internal Revenue Service itself.